In 1957, the US Geological Survey sent a fleet of twin-engine aircraft over the open range of Wyoming. Their mission was straightforward: map the terrain, catalogue the landscape, produce a photographic record for federal land management. Standard procedure. Thousands of these surveys were conducted across the American West in the post-war decades. But somewhere over the high desert basin between the Wind River Range and the Red Desert, the cameras captured something the mission report never mentioned. Foundations, not settler cabins, not homestead ruins, not anything the surveyors were prepared to explain. Massive geometric foundations stretching across open rangeland that no wagon, no railroad, no territorial deed had ever touched. The survey was filed, the photographs were archived, and for the better part of 7 decades nobody talked about it. If you've been following the questions that mainstream history refuses to sit with, subscribe right now. Hit the notification bell. Because what we're about to walk through isn't speculation. It's a paper trail, and it leads somewhere nobody in an official building wants to go. Wyoming in 1957 was not a place of secrets. It was cattle country, open sky, federal land. The BLM had jurisdiction over millions of acres. Grazing permits were the economy. The idea that something significant could exist out there, something structural, something built without any record in the territorial archives or the homestead files, was not supposed to be possible. The official history of Wyoming settlement follows a clean line. The Oregon Trail brought emigrants through the South. Fort Laramie was established in 1834, initially as a fur trading post. The Union Pacific punched through in 1869. Towns sprouted along the rail line: Cheyenne, Laramie, Rock Springs. Everything north and west of that corridor was characterized as untamed range, used seasonally by indigenous nations and later by cattle operations pushing north out of Texas and Colorado. That's the story. It fits neatly into the timeline every textbook accepts. What it doesn't account for is what's underneath. Aerial photography changed everything about how we understood the American landscape. Before aircraft, you saw land from the ground, which means you saw almost nothing. A slight rise in the terrain, a discoloration in the soil, an unusual arrangement of stones. These things could be walked past 10,000 times without registering. From the air, the geometry becomes visible: crop marks, shadow marks, the faint relief of buried structures pressed into the earth by centuries of settling. Archaeologists in Britain had been using aerial photography since the 1920s to locate Roman roads and Iron Age settlements invisible at ground level. The USGS knew this. That's part of what made the 1957 Wyoming survey significant. They were not just mapping mountains and rivers, they were producing a visual inventory of the land at a resolution and from a perspective that had never existed before. The surveyors were looking for topography. What some of those photographs showed was something else entirely. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The specific region in question covers a stretch of Sweetwater County running west-northwest from the town of Farson toward the Idaho border. This is some of the emptiest terrain in the contiguous United States. The elevation sits between 6,000 and 7,200 feet. Winters are brutal. Growing seasons are short. There is essentially no surface water outside of seasonal drainages. The idea that any pre-industrial civilization would choose to build here, let alone build at scale, is precisely the kind of idea that gets laughed out of academic conferences, which is exactly why it's worth looking at more carefully. The foundations visible in the survey photographs are not random. That's the first thing that strikes anyone who has studied the anomalies. They are not the scattered remnants of isolated structures. They are organized. There is a geometry to them, a regularity of spacing that suggests something closer to city planning than frontier improvisation. Rectangular outlines, some of them quite large, arranged in patterns that echo civic architecture rather than agricultural necessity. No territorial record accounts for them. No homestead claim covers those parcels. No military installation was ever documented in that region during the periods when such things would have generated paperwork. The Hudson's Bay Company operated fur trade networks through the northern Rockies, but left no permanent infrastructure in Sweetwater County. The Spanish colonial reach extended into the southern Rockies, but not this far north, and not with this kind of permanence. So who built them and when? This is where the conversation has to expand beyond what conventional history is comfortable holding. Because the Wyoming anomalies don't exist in isolation. They are part of a pattern that stretches from the Pacific coast to the Missouri River, from the Canadian border to the Colorado Plateau. Aerial surveys conducted throughout the 1950s and 1960s documented similar anomalies in Nevada, Montana, Oregon, and Idaho. In almost every case, the findings were archived without public follow-up. Researchers who have submitted FOIA requests for the original survey photographs have encountered a familiar sequence: acknowledgement of the archive, delays, redactions, and in some cases, the assertion that specific rolls of film are missing or damaged. Let's sit with that for a moment. Federal photographic surveys from the 1950s are generally very well preserved. The USGS maintain meticulous archive protocols. The sudden unavailability of specific survey rolls, specifically the rolls covering specific anomalous regions, is not consistent with normal archival degradation. It is consistent with something being removed from the public record. The framework that makes the most sense of these anomalies comes from research that mainstream archaeology has spent decades trying to suppress or dismiss without actually engaging. The evidence for a prior civilization on the North American continent, one possessing architectural and material capabilities far beyond what official prehistory acknowledges, has been accumulating for well over a century. Mudflood theory, as it has come to be discussed in these circles, is not a metaphor. It refers to a documented geophysical reality that large portions of the Northern Hemisphere experienced a catastrophic inundation event or series of events within the past few centuries, an event that buried existing built environments under several feet of sediment and reset the historical record to zero. The survivors of this event either had no memory of what came before, or they inherited institutions specifically designed to manage and conceal that memory. What we call the 19th century settlement of the American West may not have been settlement at all. It may have been resettlement. It may have been the reoccupation of a landscape already structured, already organized, already built by a civilization whose existence does not fit the timeline that Western academic history has constructed. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. The Wyoming foundations are difficult to explain within the conventional framework. They become straightforward within this one. Consider the specifics. The foundations documented in the 1957 survey show wall footings consistent with large-scale masonry construction. Not log construction, not adobe construction, stone. The dimensions of some of the rectangular outlines suggest interior spaces of 10,000 square feet or more. That is not a homestead. That is not a trading post. That is a civic building, the kind of structure that presupposes a functioning urban context, supply chains, skilled labor, institutional organization. Wyoming had none of those things in the official settlement record before the railroad. After the railroad, the towns that grew up were wooden, functional, and thoroughly documented. Nothing in the territorial archives of Wyoming Territory, established in 1869, references the demolition or clearing of pre-existing masonry structures on open rangeland. Nothing in the early homestead surveys mentions working around existing foundations. The land was treated as empty, because within the official story it was empty. But it wasn't. There is a related body of evidence that corroborates the aerial survey data without depending on it. Oral accounts from Shoshone and Bannock communities in the Wind River and Bear River regions describe ruins in the high desert that predate indigenous memory. These are not accounts of indigenous construction. They describe encountering structures that were already ancient, already ruined, already abandoned when their own ancestors arrived in the region. This testimony has been systematically excluded from the academic record because it does not fit the model in which indigenous arrival to the Americas is the beginning of human history on this continent. That exclusion is itself data. When institutions consistently filter out evidence pointing in a particular direction, the direction the evidence points matters more, not less. The 1957 Wyoming survey becomes a node in a much larger network of suppressed documentation. The Smithsonian Institution's record of artifacts removed from mound sites across the Ohio and Mississippi valleys in the late 19th century and subsequently lost or reclassified. The anomalous stone constructions in the Ozarks and in upstate New York that predate any known indigenous or European presence. The infrastructure visible in early daguerreotypes of Western cities that appears too advanced, too complete, too finished for the alleged construction timelines attached to those cities. San Francisco in the 1850s, Salt Lake City in the 1860s, Denver in the early territorial period. The photographic record shows cities that look built, not built up. The difference matters. A city that emerges from wilderness looks provisional at its edges and substantial only at its centre. The cities in these photographs look as though they were placed into a landscape, as though the infrastructure already existed and the population moved into it. Wyoming's open range in 1957 looks empty from the ground. From the air it tells a different story. The question of why the survey was never published is less mysterious than it might seem once you accept the premise that there was something to conceal. The post-war American institutional apparatus was deeply invested in a particular narrative of continental history, one in which the land west of the Mississippi was wilderness until Europeans arrived, in which the archaeological clock started with Folsom Points and Clovis spear tips, in which nothing of architectural consequence predated the colonial period. That narrative had enormous political utility. It justified removal, it justified treaty violations, it justified the entire framework of manifest destiny by establishing that there was no prior civilization to have a claim. If aerial photography was revealing foundations, extensive, organized, civic-scale foundations, across open federal land in Wyoming and Nevada and Montana, the political and legal implications were significant enough to motivate institutional suppression. This is not speculation about conspiracy. This is an observation about institutional incentive. Institutions protect the narratives that protect them. The USGS did not need to conduct a coordinated cover-up. It simply needed to file the photographs, leave them unpublished, and move on to the next survey. Researchers who have worked to reconstruct the Wyoming evidence operate under significant constraints. The original photographic negatives from the 1957 survey would be the definitive record. Their current status is unclear. What survives are contact prints that circulated among a small number of individuals in the 1970s and 1980s, along with the accounts of those individuals. Some of those accounts describe the dimensions and geometry of the foundations in enough detail to allow for comparison with known architectural typologies from other contexts. The comparisons are not comfortable for official history. The geometric regularities, the scale of the larger outlines, the use of specific proportional relationships between structures, these features appear in civic architecture from cultures as distant as Moorish Iberia and Mughal India, not as influence. As parallel, which within the conventional framework of isolated civilizational development is impossible. Within a framework that posits a single prior global civilization, it is exactly what you would expect to find. The Tartarian hypothesis, as it has been formulated by researchers working outside institutional channels, proposes that North America, Europe, Central Asia, and parts of South America were all part of a single advanced civilization, one that was capable of constructing buildings at a scale and with a sophistication that current academic history attributes exclusively to the modern industrial period. The evidence for this civilization is not confined to architecture. It appears in historical maps that show coastlines surveyed with impossible accuracy for the alleged dates of their creation. It appears in the anomalous precision of pre-industrial buildings whose construction mechanics cannot be replicated with the tools officially available at the time of their construction. It appears in the structural similarities between buildings on opposite sides of the planet that, within the conventional framework of isolated development, should look nothing alike. And it appears in aerial surveys of Wyoming rangeland that were filed, archived, and never discussed again. The 1957 survey is not a single piece of evidence. It is a window into a methodology. If the federal government's own photographic surveys were capturing evidence of prior civilization across the American West, and if the standard institutional response was to archive without publication, then the question is not whether the evidence exists. The question is how much of it is still accessible. Some of it is. Persistent FOIA requests have recovered partial records from Nevada and Montana, surveys conducted in the same era. The anomalies documented there are consistent with what the Wyoming accounts describe. Foundations, geometric regularity, scale inconsistent with any documented settlement history. The pattern is not an accident. What the 1957 Wyoming aerial survey represents, in the broadest sense, is a moment when the instruments of the modern state accidentally did what modern states are not supposed to do. They looked, they saw, and then the institutional machinery engaged, not with urgency, not with drama, but with the quiet efficiency of a system that knows what it needs to not know. The rangeland is still there. The sky above it is still there. And somewhere in a federal archive, on rolls of film that may or may not be missing, the foundations are still visible from the air. The land remembers what the record forgot. If this is the kind of history that doesn't show up in textbooks but keeps showing up in the evidence, you know where to go. Subscribe and click the video on screen. The story is bigger than Wyoming.